History remembers its monsters. We give them names, we chart their crimes, and we tell their stories to remind ourselves that the darkness is real. But our deepest fears are not reserved for the tyrants or the warlords. They are for the darkness that wears a familiar face. The evil that grows in places we have sworn to protect. What happens when the monster is not a man, but a child? In the summer of 1867, in a remote farming community gasping for air outside Sedalia, Missouri, this question would find its horrifying answer. The subject was an 8-year-old boy named Timothy Caldwell, and his case would become the most disturbing medical study ever documented in the American Midwest, a story whispered in hushed tones for generations before being buried by shame and disbelief. Our guide into this abyss is Dr. Samuel Harding, the region's only formally trained physician. He was a man of science and reason, a man whose hands had seen the worst of what men could do to one another on the battlefields of the Civil War. Yet what he witnessed in that small, blonde-haired boy would shake his understanding of humanity to its core. He filled 3 leather-bound journals, not just with medical observations, but with a desperate attempt to chronicle a presence that defied every known principle of nature and medicine. To the casual observer, to the neighbor on the dusty road or the merchant in town, Timothy Caldwell was a model of childhood propriety. He was quiet, polite, even charming. But beneath the placid, innocent surface, something coiled and waited in ancient coldness that 19th century science had no name for, no category to place it in. Over the course of 6 months, a shadow fell over Sedalia County. 3 people died in what were ruled as tragic accidents. Dozens of farm animals were found dead under baffling circumstances. A wave of misfortune that all seemed to radiate from a single point, a pale-eyed child whose smile, as Dr. Harding would later write, never once seemed to reach his soul. The official records were eventually sealed by unnerved local authorities, hidden away for more than a century as if the paper they were written on was cursed. But the truth of Timothy Caldwell reveals a darkness that challenges everything we believe about the innocence of youth and the capacity for evil. Before we unseal those records and walk beside Dr. Harding into the heart of this mystery, if this kind of deep dive into history's most unsettling corners is what you seek, please consider subscribing to our channel and ringing the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single chapter of our journey into America's darkest secrets. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our community of history enthusiasts is the reason we explore these forgotten stories. The saga that would forever stain the name Timothy Caldwell began not with a scream, but with a silence of loss. The Missouri of 1867 was a state still bleeding. As a border state, it hadn't just sent its sons to war. It had pitted neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. The wounds weren't just on distant battlefields, they were fresh, festering sores in every town, on every farm. Communities like Sedalia were hollowed out, populated by widows in black, by children who could not remember their father's face, and by men who had returned from the conflict with bodies maimed and spirits broken. It was a land of ghosts, where every sunset seemed to mourn the promise of what had been lost. The Caldwell farm, nestled in a valley 15 miles south of town, was a testament to this broken dream. James and Martha Caldwell had poured their sweat and hopes into that soil, dreaming of a legacy of cattle and corn. But that dream, like so many others, was buried in the blood-soaked earth of the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861, where James fell. Martha, a woman of formidable will, tried to tame the land alone. But the bitter winter of 1865 was crueler than any army. Consumption stole the air from her lungs, leaving her son, Thomas, barely 21, to inherit a world of debt and grief. He was left with land he could manage and a heart hardened by the relentless tide of loss. It was a terrible inheritance, and it would soon grow heavier. Then, in the bleak winter of 1865, a letter arrived. A brittle piece of paper that would alter the course of their lives forever. It brought news that Thomas's brother, William, was dead. He had not fallen heroically in battle, but had wasted away in the living hell of Andersonville prison, a place whose name was already synonymous with starvation, disease, and unimaginable suffering. The letter also informed Thomas that William had left behind a widow and an 8-year-old son. The widow, it seemed, had quickly succumbed to her own grief and illness, leaving the boy, Timothy, an orphan. For Thomas, the news was a complex, bitter pill. He saw not a nephew to be loved, but another burden in a life already overloaded with them. Yet, in the cold calculus of survival, he also saw an opportunity. The boy was old enough to work. He would need a home, and Thomas desperately needed another pair of hands to fight back the relentless decay of the farm. Thomas Caldwell was a hard man, not born that way, but forged into it by the relentless pressures of war, debt, and loss. His wife, Sarah, had once been a woman of softer disposition, but the bitter sorrow of their childless years had sharpened her tongue and leached the warmth from her spirit. Their home was not one of comfort, but of shared, unspoken disappointments, a house of silences, where the creak of the floorboards often spoke louder than they did. Neither was remotely suited for the delicate task of raising a child, especially one who arrived at their door in the spring of 1866. As the first green shoots were pushing through the cold Missouri soil, he carried nothing but a small, stained cloth bag and possessed eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. Timothy Caldwell was small for his age, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent, a canvas that would burn and blister under the harsh Midwestern sun. His blonde hair was kept short and severe by his Aunt Sarah, a practical measure against the ever-present threat of lice. He spoke little of the life he had lived before the farm, and when pressed, he offered only disconnected fragments, like pieces of a shattered photograph. His father had been a soldier. His mother had coughed blood into a white handkerchief. He had stayed with neighbors for a time after she was gone. He delivered these facts with no discernible emotion, as if reciting a page from someone else's history. What truly struck the adults he met, what made them comment on him to one another, was his impeccable and unnerving politeness. He never failed to say, "Yes, sir," or "Yes, ma'am." He never complained about the back-breaking work or the frequent, sharp punishments. He was, in every outward appearance, the very model of a well-behaved, resilient child who had endured tragedy with quiet strength. He was a perfect little ghost, moving through his chores with a placid obedience that should have been comforting, but instead felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was a performance so flawless it erased the boy himself, leaving behind a perfectly polite and hollow shell. Drive, Samuel Harding first laid eyes on Timothy Caldwell on a sweltering market day in June of 1866. The boy had accompanied his uncle to town for supplies, a small shadow trailing a large, weary man. Drive. Harding was a man whose entire life was dedicated to observation. A graduate of the esteemed Missouri Medical College, he was one of the few formally trained physicians west of St. Louis, a beacon of modern science and a land still governed by folk remedies and superstition. But his most profound education had not come from textbooks. It had come from the blood-soaked floors of field hospitals, where for years he had treated the shattered bodies of both Union and Confederate soldiers. In that cauldron of human suffering, he had learned to read men not by their words, but by the subtle language of their bodies, the flicker of fear in a stoic eye, the tremor in a hand that claimed to be steady, the vacant stare of a soul already departed from a body still breathing. He had looked into the eyes of killers, heroes, cowards, and boys pretending to be men, and he believed he had learned to recognize the truth of a person's character in an instant. But on that June afternoon, his well-honed instincts failed him. As Thomas Caldwell discussed the price of feed, Dr. Harding turned his attention to the boy standing silently by the supply wagon. Something about him immediately snagged the doctor's attention, an inexplicable dissonance that set his teeth on edge. The child was perfectly still, a stark contrast to the usual fidgeting and restless energy of rural children, unaccustomed to the bustle of town. He was watching, not with the wide-eyed wonder of a child, but with the focused stillness of a predator. When Harding offered a friendly greeting, the boy responded with the practiced respect he showed everyone, his voice clear and his gaze direct. Yet the doctor felt a profound and visceral discomfort, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. It was a feeling he had not experienced since the war, a primal alarm that his rational mind could not immediately explain. That night, unable to shake the encounter, Dr. Harding opened his journal and tried to distill the feeling into words. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows across the page as he wrote. The child was perfectly respectful. He answered my questions directly, maintained appropriate eye contact, and displayed none of the shyness or apprehension typical of children his age encountering a stranger. Yet, I found myself deeply and inexplicably uncomfortable in his presence. He paused, chewing the end of his pen, searching for the right words. His gaze held an intensity that seemed to suggest he was studying me, with the same clinical interest that I typically reserve for my patients. It was this detail that haunted him most. The boy's eyes were not windows to a soul. They were lenses. They were not looking at him, but into him, analyzing, cataloging, and assessing. For a terrifying moment, Dr. Harding, the man of science, had felt like the specimen under the microscope, his own humanity being dissected by the unwavering gaze of an 8-year-old child. Dr. Harding's unease was a private, intellectual puzzle, but he was not the only one who felt that something about the Caldwell boy was amiss. In the small, tightly knit farming communities that dotted the Missouri landscape, privacy was a luxury few could afford. News traveled on the when and personal affairs were common knowledge, dissected over dinner tables and discussed in hushed tones at the general store. The Caldwell farm was isolated, but not so much that it was invisible to the watchful eyes of its neighbors. The closest of these were Samuel and Eleanora Patterson, whose property bordered the Caldwell land to the east. Samuel was a man of the earth, practical, straightforward, and unwilling to believe in anything he couldn't fix with his own two hands. His wife, Eleanora, however, possessed a quieter, more intuitive wisdom. She understood the unspoken language of the seasons, the moods of her livestock, and the subtle currents of human nature. From her porch, she had a clear view of the Caldwell fields, and she often found her gaze drawn to the small figure of Timothy. She remarked to her husband that the boy worked with a focus that was profoundly unnatural for a child his age. Other boys would dawdle, skip stones, or chase grasshoppers. They would work in bursts of energy, followed by periods of distraction. But not Timothy. He moved with a relentless, metronomic efficiency, never seeming to tire, never pausing to play or rest as all children naturally do. His movements were economical and precise, whether he was mending a fence or hoeing a row of corn. It's like watching a little machine, she told Samuel over dinner one evening, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and concern. He worked steady from sunrise to sunset, never a complaint, never slowing. It ain't natural, Sam. It ain't natural for a boy to have no play in him at all. Her husband would grunt in reply, attributing it to the boy's difficult upbringing. But Eleanora's unease went deeper, solidifying into a quiet dread because of the chickens. The Patterson farm kept a large flock, and Eleanora noticed a bizarre and consistent pattern. Her birds, normally content to scratch and peck across their entire yard, would become frantic whenever Timothy was near the property line. If the boy was simply walking down the path that ran alongside the fence, a wave of panic would ripple through the coop. They would cluster together on the far side of their enclosure, a squawking, terrified mass of ruffled feathers, refusing to venture anywhere near the fence until he was long gone. Samuel dismissed it as coincidence, perhaps the boy's shadow or a stray dog spooking them. But Eleanora knew better. She had seen the boy pay the chickens no mind, his gaze fixed forward as he walked. It was his mere presence that terrified them. She couldn't shake the chilling conviction that her animals, in their primal, honest wisdom, could sense something that the humans missed that they did not see. A polite, hardworking boy, but a predator walking in their midst. The first death came on an afternoon in late August, under a sun so merciless and heavy it seemed to press the very air from the sky. The victim was little Mary Fletcher, the 5-year-old daughter of the town blacksmith, a child known throughout the community for her bright, bubbling laugh and a fearless tendency to wander wherever her curiosity led her. She had been playing near Willow Creek, a shallow, meandering stream whose cold waters offered a brief respite from the suffocating heat. The creek ran between several properties, a common playground for the local children, its banks winding past the edge of the Caldwell farm. The last person to see her alive, and the first to find her dead, was Timothy Caldwell. He appeared on the Fletcher's doorstep just as the family was sitting down for supper, the familiar sounds of clinking forks and evening conversation filling their small home. Timothy stood on the threshold, a solemn figure with his clothes still damp from the creek, his face pale with what the Fletchers, in their impending grief, would interpret as genuine distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, and the family noted how his voice, though quiet, was unnervingly steady. "I found Mary by the creek. I think she's hurt bad. She's not breathing." The words shattered the evening peace. A frantic party of men, their hearts pounding with dread, rushed to the creek, their lanterns cutting panic beams through the deepening twilight. They found Mary Fletcher face down in a pool of water that was barely 18 inches deep. Dr. Harding was summoned immediately, his buggy kicking up a cloud of dust as he raced from town. By the time he arrived, the scene was one of quiet, unbearable sorrow. He performed his grim duty, determining that the child had drowned, a tragic, but sadly not uncommon accident in rural communities where water was a constant, unsupervised temptation for young children. Case closed. Except for Dr. Harding, it wasn't. What deeply troubled him was not the death itself, but Timothy's account of discovering the body back at the Fletcher home. The doctor questioned the boy, seeking to understand the sequence of events. Timothy provided a description of the scene that was so detailed, so remarkably precise. It sent a chill down the doctor's spine. He described the exact position of Mary's limbs, the way her calico dress had been snagged on a submerged branch, even the slight discoloration of the water around her face when pressed about how he had come to be in that particular spot at that particular time. Timothy had a ready and reasonable answer. "I was looking for a lost calf, sir," he explained, his eyes wide and earnest. "Uncle Thomas sent me." This was later confirmed by a distraught Thomas Caldwell. One of their calves had indeed gone missing that morning. The alibi was perfect, yet it was the very perfection of the story that bothered Harding, a child, frightened and upset by such a gruesome discovery, should have had a frantic, fragmented memory of the event. But Timothy's recall was that of a calm, detached observer logging data. That night, Harding made another entry in his journal. The boy's recall was remarkably precise. Such attention to detail and a state of professed shock seems contrary to human nature. It was as if he were describing not a tragedy he had stumbled upon, but a scene he had carefully arranged. The lost calf was found 2 days later, healthy and unharmed, grazing peacefully in a meadow nearly a mile in the opposite direction from where Mary Fletcher had taken her last breath. In the wake of the tragedy, the devastated Fletcher family received Timothy's quiet sympathy with profound gratitude. In their fog of grief, the boy was not a source of suspicion, but a small, brave hero. He was, after all, the one who had found their daughter, the one who had cut short the terrible hours of uncertainty. The community wrapped its arms around both the Fletchers and the Caldwells. Seeing them all as victims of a cruel twist of fate, Timothy played his part to perfection, accepting their praise and sympathy with a somber humility that adults mistook for maturity. Beyond his years, at the funeral, he sat silently in the pew between his aunt and uncle, a perfect portrait of childhood sorrow. His head was bowed respectfully throughout the somber service, his small hands clasped in his lap. When the final prayer was said, he approached Mary's heartbroken father, "I wish I could have found her sooner, sir," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of hushed regret. The words, so simple and seemingly heartfelt, brought fresh tears to the man's eyes. But across the small, crowded church, Eleanora Patterson was watching. She saw the same scene as everyone else, the grieving family, the supportive community, the quiet orphan boy. Yet she saw it with the eyes that had watched the chickens scatter in unholy terror. She saw the moment when Mary Fletcher's mother, unable to bear the sight of the small pine coffin, collapsed into a heap of raw, animal grief. She saw hardened farmers, men who had faced down charging soldiers and brutal winters, openly weeping, their faces crumpled in sorrow. The church was an ocean of authentic, overwhelming pain, and in the middle of it all sat Timothy Caldwell. His head was bowed, yes, but when he thought no one was looking, when the pastor's voice droned on and all eyes were on the grieving family, he would lift his gaze just slightly. Eleanora saw it clearly, a detail that would nag at her for days and weeks to come. In a room flooded with tears, Timothy Caldwell's pale blue eyes remained perfectly dry. They were not vacant with shock or red-rimmed with grief. They were watchful, alert, and unnervingly clear. He was taking in every detail of the scene around him, not as a participant in a tragedy, but as a spectator at a fascinating performance, cataloging the very human agony that he himself could not, or would not, feel. The fragile peace of Sedalia County lasted just 3 weeks. The second death came not in the water, but on the rocks. The victim was Henrik Larsson, a solitary Norwegian immigrant who had spent his youth as a logger before crippling arthritis forced him into a quieter retirement. He was a man of the woods, known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the local terrain and for the wild beehives. He tended at the top of a rocky outcrop known locally and prophetically as Devil's Bluff. The bluff was a treacherous 40-foot cliff that loomed over the same creek where Mary Fletcher had drowned, and Henrik was known to climb it with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. He was found at the bottom, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his neck broken. Once again, Timothy Caldwell was at the center of the discovery. He told the solemn crowd that gathered at the base of the cliff that he had been walking home from town when he spotted something unusual. "I saw Mr. Larson's hat caught on a thorn bush," Timothy explained to the sheriff, his voice even. "I called out his name, but I didn't get an answer, so I climbed down to look." Dr. Harding's examination revealed that the old man had likely died instantly upon impact. It was another tragic, plausible accident, but the details immediately snagged his attention. The first was the quiet skepticism of the other men. Mr. Larson knew those bluffs better than any man in this county. Samuel Patterson muttered to Dr. Harding, shaking his head in disbelief. He'd been climbing up there for 30 years. Never so much as a stumble. It don't make sense he'd fall now. The second detail was the presence of several dead honeybees scattered on and around the old man's body. It was then that Timothy, ever helpful, offered a theory. He was always talking about how angry the bees get when you disturb them. The boy said to the sheriff, maybe they swarmed him and he got confused and lost his footing. The explanation was brilliant in its simplicity. It explained the fall of an experienced climber and accounted for the dead bees. It satisfied the sheriff and the onlookers, who nodded in grim understanding. But it did not satisfy Dr. Harding. The explanation was to me, to perfect, just like the story of the lost calf. Later that afternoon, driven by a suspicion that was now growing into a sickening certainty, Harding climbed to the top of Devil's Bluff himself. He found the wild beehives exactly where Henrik was known to keep them. The air hummed with activity, but the bees were not agitated. They showed no signs of having recently swarmed. They were calm, going about their business. He then considered the dead bees at the bottom of the cliff. If a swarm had attacked Henrik at the top, causing him to fall, there should have been evidence of their fury all along his path. Agitated bees at the hive, dead ones scattered down the rock face. Instead, the dead insects were found in a tight, unnatural cluster directly around the impact site. It was as if they hadn't caused the fall. but had simply appeared at its conclusion. Standing there, with the wind whistling in his ears, Dr. Harding realized he was not looking at the scene of an accident. He was looking at a carefully constructed narrative, and the dead bees were a deliberate, misleading clue left by an author of unimaginable cunning. The third death, the one that would shatter any lingering illusions of coincidence, came with the turning of the leaves in September. The cool air that promised relief from the summer heat instead carried a new and more intimate terror. The victim was 6-year-old Jacob Mills, a boy with a tangle of brown hair and a shy smile, who vanished one afternoon while playing in the woods near his family's small, isolated cabin. When he didn't return for supper, a familiar, cold dread washed over the community. Immediately, a search party was formed. For 3 days and 3 nights, the men of Sedalia County combed the dense woods, their lanterns and torches creating a swarm of desperate, dancing lights in the oppressive darkness. Their calls of Jacob grew hoarser and more hopeless with each passing hour. And at the very heart of this frantic effort was Timothy Caldwell. He had been one of the first to volunteer, presenting himself to Jacob's distraught father with a look of solemn determination. During the search, the boy displayed a stamina and knowledge of the wilderness that stunned the grown men he searched alongside. While seasoned farmers and woodsmen grew weary and disoriented in the tangled terrain, Timothy moved through it with an almost supernatural ease. He seemed to know every trail, every creek bed, every hidden hollow. When asked how he had learned the unforgiving landscape so well, he provided his usual, plausible explanation. He often explored the woods, he said, looking for useful plants and herbs that his Aunt Sarah could use for cooking and medicine. The men, impressed by his maturity and skill, began to follow his lead, never suspecting that their knowledgeable young guide was leading them in circles, ensuring their search remained just out of reach of its target. Then, on the 4th day, as a gray, hopeless dawn broke over the Mills cabin, Timothy appeared from the mist. He looked exhausted. His clothes were torn by thorns, and his face was smudged with dirt, a perfect picture of a tireless hero. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's father, his voice heavy with carefully rehearsed fatigue. "There's an old, abandoned well about a half-mile north of here. It's almost completely covered. I was passing by and I thought I heard what sounded like crying." He led the men, their hearts suddenly pounding with a renewed, fragile hope, to a part of the woods they had somehow overlooked. There, concealed by a careful arrangement of fallen logs and a thick tangle of overgrown brush, was the mouth of an old stone well. From its dark, silent depths, they pulled the broken body of Jacob Mills. He was alive, but just barely, his eyes fluttering, his body wasted by dehydration and exposure. For a fleeting, miraculous moment, it seemed as though a tragedy had been averted. But the boy was too far gone. Dr. Harding was summoned, but he knew from the moment he saw the child that there was little he could do. Jacob Mill's small body, starved of water and warmth for nearly 4 days, was unable to recover from the ordeal. He died within hours of being pulled from the well, surrounded by his heartbroken family. The cabin was a cramped, suffocating space, thick with the scent of lamp oil and the sound of whispered prayers and stifled sobs, while the Mills family maintained their desperate vigil around their dying son. Timothy sat quietly in a rocking chair in the corner of the room, a picture of solemn empathy, his head bowed, apparently deep in prayer for the little boy he had so heroically rescued. But Dr. Harding, his mind already racing with 1,000 chilling questions, positioned himself where he could observe the boy without being noticed. And what he saw in that dim, grief-stricken cabin would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. Timothy wasn't praying. His lips were moving, yes, but his eyes were not closed in supplication. They were wide open, fixed on the dying form of Jacob Mills with an unnerving, predatory intensity that seemed almost scientific. Harding, a man who had witnessed death in all its forms, recognized the look immediately. It was the gaze of pure, dispassionate observation. Timothy appeared to be mentally cataloging every single detail of the Dying process. The shallow, labored breathing that rattled in Jacob's chest, the bluish tint that crept into his pale skin, the way consciousness flickered in and out of his eyes like a guttering candle. He was not watching a tragedy. He was watching a clinical procedure. The slight movements of his lips were not prayers, Harding realized, but were more likely the boy murmuring his observations to himself, committing the precious data to memory. Then, the moment of death arrived. Jacob Mills took one final, shuddering breath, and a raw, keening wail of anguish erupted from his mother. In that singular, explosive moment of grief, as all attention was focused on the tragic bed, Dr. Harding's eyes shot to the corner of the room for a fraction of a second, before Timothy had time to rearrange his features into a mask of appropriate shock. Harding saw the boy's true reaction. There was no grief. There was no fear. There was no shock. Instead, in the cold, clear depths of Timothy Caldwell's eyes, there was a flicker of something that the doctor could only describe as profound and chilling satisfaction. It was the quiet, triumphant look of a researcher whose hypothesis had been proven correct, whose experiment had yielded a perfect and fascinating result. In that instant, all of Dr. Harding's suspicions, fears, and theories coalesced into a single, monolithic, and terrifying truth. He was not dealing with a troubled child. He was in the presence of a monster. After the funeral of Jacob Mills, Dr. Harding made a solemn vow. The time for passive observation was over. He was no longer a mere chronicler of events. He was now an investigator, a hunter, operating in secret. He knew he could not go to the authorities. What proof did he have? A gut feeling? A look in a boy's eye? They would think the horrors of the war had finally broken his mind. No, he had to gather evidence, to build a case so undeniable that the world would be forced to see the monster hiding behind a child's face. His investigation began in earnest in October of 1866. He used his position as the community's physician as the perfect cover, making regular visits to farms and homesteads throughout the county, ostensibly checking on the health of families still recovering from the hardships of the war. With his black bag in hand and a kind word for everyone, he was welcomed into every home, where he listened not just to the rhythms of heartbeats and lungs, but to the whispers of misfortune that seemed to follow in Timothy Caldwell's wake. What he discovered was a disturbing and ever-widening circle of tragedy. It began with the animals. Livestock on the farms neighboring the Caldwell property had been dying at a rate that defied all explanation. These were not deaths from disease, which Harding could have easily identified, but from a bizarre series of what everyone had written off as freak accidents. Chickens were found with their necks cleanly broken, attributed to foxes that somehow left no tracks and stole no other birds. Pigs suffer mysterious, deep wounds that would fester and lead to a slow, agonizing death. Horses, otherwise healthy, would develop a sudden, inexplicable lameness that forced farmers to put them down. His first real breakthrough came when he spoke again with Eleanora Patterson. She confided in him that she had lost 17 chickens in the past 2 months alone. "It's the strangest thing, doctor," she said, her brow furrowed with a frustration that went beyond financial loss. "They're dying, 1 or 2 at a time, always found in the morning with their necks broken clean. My husband says it's foxes, but I've never seen fox sign around the coop. And the way they're killed, it's to neat." Harding asked to examine the most recent casualties. What he found confirmed her suspicions and chilled him to the bone. The chickens had been killed with a precise and terrible skill. The force had been applied to a specific point at the base of the skull, severing the spinal cord instantly. It was not the random, tearing violence of a predator's attack. It was the deliberate, controlled, and knowledgeable work of a practiced hand, someone who understood anatomy. It was an execution. This was Timothy's signature, and now that Harding knew what to look for, he saw it everywhere. The patterns of animal death provided a grim context, but to understand the mind of the killer, Dr. Harding knew he had to get closer to the source. He began making more frequent medical visits to the Caldwell farm, using Thomas's lingering ailments as a pretext. During these visits, he noticed that Timothy was always present, a small, silent sentinel in the corner of the room. As Dr. Harding examined his uncle, checking his breathing or applying a salve, the boy would watch every move with an unnerving, scholarly interest. Soon, the quiet observation turned into active inquiry. Timothy began asking questions about anatomy and medical procedures. Questions so advanced and specific they were utterly alien coming from the mouth of a child. "How do you know if someone's really dead, doctor?" he asked one afternoon, his tone as casual as if he were asking about the weather. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping." When Harding, taken aback, pressed him on his morbid curiosity, Timothy had a polished answer ready. "Uncle Thomas says I need to know how to handle emergencies," he explained smoothly, "since we're so far from town." The explanation was entirely reasonable, and yet it felt profoundly false. It was the clinical quality of Timothy's interest that disturbed Harding. The boy didn't ask what to do to help someone who was hurt. He asked about the mechanics of dying itself. How long did it take? What were the surest signs of death? Could a person survive certain kinds of trauma? It was the detached curiosity a medical student might show when studying a cadaver. During these conversations, Harding began a dangerous game, deliberately feeding Timothy false information claiming certain non-fatal injuries were always lethal, or misattributing symptoms to gauge his reaction. Timothy never challenged these falsehoods directly, but Harding could see him filing every piece of information away with flawless retention. His mind a cold, perfect receptacle for data, true or false. The most disturbing conversations, however, were when Harding, hoping to shock the boy into a normal human reaction, recounted some of his experiences treating soldiers during the war. While most children would have recoiled in horror, Timothy listened with a rapt and hungry attention, his eyes wide with fascination, not fear. He asked for graphic details about wound patterns, the rates of blood loss from different types of injuries, and the chances of survival after amputations. Then came the question that would freeze itself in Dr. Harding's memory forever. The doctor had been describing a field surgery, and Timothy leaned forward, his pale blue eyes fixed intently on Harding's face. "Did they scream a lot when you cut off their arms?" he asked, his voice a soft, genuinely curious whisper. "Or were they to hurt to make any noise?" The question, delivered with such polite, academic innocence, sent a chill through Dr. Harding that was colder than any winter wind. In that moment, he understood the boy's interest was not in the science of death, but in the art of suffering. By November of 1866, Dr. Harding had filled nearly to complete journals with his meticulous and terrifying observations. The picture that emerged was of a child who possessed an adult as understanding of violence and a amply chilling absence of human empathy. But notes and suspicions were not the same as evidence, and hard evidence was what Harding would need if he hoped to protect the community from what he now believed to be a budding serial predator. The opportunity he had been waiting for arrived when Thomas Caldwell, straining to bring in the last of the fall harvest, severely injured his back. The injury was legitimate and required weeks of bed rest and daily medical visits, giving Dr. Harding unprecedented and regular access to the Caldwell household. It was during one of these extended visits, while engaging Timothy in a carefully casual conversation, that the boy mentioned a cave hidden in the woods behind the farm, a place where he went to think and be alone. Days later, with a cold knot of dread in his stomach, Dr. Harding went in search of it. He found the entrance concealed behind a curtain of wild vines, a dark slash in the earth that seemed to exhale a cold, damp breath. Lighting a lantern, he stepped inside. The small cavern smelled of wet stone, dirt, and something else, something metallic and foul. As his eyes adjusted, he saw that this was no ordinary childhood hideout. This was a laboratory. On one side of the cave, a collection of animal bones was arranged with unnerving precision, sorted by size and species. On a flat rock in the center lay a series of crude, but effective surgical instruments, fashioned from sharpened farm tools, pieces of wire, and shards of glass. It was a place of methodical, scientific horror. But the most disturbing discovery was tucked away in a dry corner, wrapped in oilcloth. It was a portfolio of drawings, rendered with a surprising and delicate artistic skill. As Harding held the lantern closer, his blood turned to ice. The pages were filled with detailed, anatomically correct sketches of rabbits, squirrels, birds, and even a neighbor's missing dog, all depicted in various stages of mutilation and dissection. Each horrifying image was accompanied by notes, written in Timothy's neat, careful handwriting, documenting his experiments. He recorded the animals' reactions to pain, the time it took for them to die, and his observations on which methods of torture caused the most prolonged and exquisite suffering. Harding's hands trembled as he read one notation beside a detailed drawing of a rabbit, its eyes rendered as dark, empty sockets. Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes. The childish script read. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat. In that moment, standing in the cold, silent dark of the cave, Dr. Harding finally understood. The accidental deaths on the neighboring farms were not accidents at all. They were the result of Timothy's desire to test his methods on larger subjects, graduating from the small creatures he could capture to the livestock he could access. This cave was his classroom, and cruelty was his curriculum. As Dr. Harding stood there, the foul air of the cave thickened his lungs. He believed he had discovered the bottom of the boy's depravity. He thought the animal drawings represented the full extent of this secret. Horrifying hobby sickened to his soul. He began to gather the dreadful portfolio, his mind reeling with how to present such monstrous evidence. But as he reached for the last of the papers, his fingers brushed against another, smaller bundle tucked even deeper into the crevice. It was wrapped separately and tied with a piece of twine. With trembling hands, he untied the knot and unrolled the papers. The drawing on top was not of an animal. It was of a human figure. A small child with blonde pigtails and a familiar calico dress, standing by a creek. It was unmistakably Mary Fletcher. On the same page, a second sketch showed her face down in the water, accompanied by speculative notes in the margin about water temperature, the time required for asphyxiation, and the lung capacity of a female child. His heart pounding against his ribs, Harding frantically flipped to the next page. It was a diagram of Devil's Bluff, showing the trajectory of a falling body, complete with calculations about terminal velocity and the force required to sever a human spine. Upon impact, it was Henrik Larsson. The third set of drawings was the most monstrous of all. It was a series of sketches, clearly drawn over several days, depicting a small boy at the bottom of a dark well. The annotations were a horrifyingly clinical study of the effects of prolonged dehydration and exposure on the human body. He was not Jacob. He was the subject. His thirst was not described in terms of suffering, but in cold, medical observations of decreased skin turgor and sunken eyes. Timothy Caldwell had not simply been present when these people died. He had not merely stumbled upon these tragedies. He had conceived them, planned them with the meticulous detail of an architect, executed them with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon, and then documented the results for future study. The lost calf, the angry bees, the cry in the woods, they were all just clever variables, elegant pieces of misdirection in his ghastly human experiments. The horror in Sedalia County, Dr. Harding now realized, was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Dr. Harding stumbled out of the cave into the gray November light, the portfolio of drawings clutched in his hand like a slab of ice. He finally had it, the cold, hard, irrefutable proof. But as he walked back towards the farm, a deeper, more chilling realization set in. The very monstrosity of the evidence was its own offense. Who would believe it? If he presented these horrific, skillfully rendered drawings to Sheriff Crawford, what would he say? That an 8-year-old boy had not only murdered 3 people, but had done so as part of a long-term scientific study into the nature of suffering. He, a respected physician, would be dismissed as a madman, his mind finally broken by the lingering horrors of the war. The evidence would be explained away as the fantasies of a traumatized orphan, and Timothy, defended and pitied, would be free to continue his work. Harding was trapped. He was the only person in the world who knew the truth, and the truth was simply too terrible to be believed. He decided on a desperate, dangerous course of action. He had to confront the monster directly. During his next visit to the Caldwell farm, under the pretense of checking the livestock in the far pasture, he asked Timothy to walk with him. Once they were far from the house, surrounded by the bleak, barren landscape of late autumn, Dr. Harding stopped. He turned to face the small boy who walked beside him, his expression grim. "I found the cave, Timothy," he said, his voice low and steady. "I found your drawings." He watched the boy's face for any reaction, a flicker of fear, a flash of anger, the stammering of a denial. He saw nothing. Timothy's expression did not change. He simply listened calmly as Dr. Harding described the neatly arranged bones, the crude tools, and the portfolio of horrors. He even nodded slightly at the mention of the drawings, as if confirming the accuracy of the doctor's inventory. When Harding finished, a heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the whistling of the cold wind. It was Timothy who spoke first. "You're not going to tell anyone," he said. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a statement of absolute fact, delivered with a confidence that was more chilling than any threat. "Why wouldn't I, Doctor?" Harding asked, genuinely stunned by the boy's audacity. Timothy looked up at him, and for the first time, the doctor saw the faintest glimmer of a smile touch the boy's lips. "Because no one would believe you," he said simply. "They'll say you're crazy, and because..." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze boring into the doctor's soul. "You're curious. You want to see what I'll do next." The words struck Dr. Harding with the force of a physical blow, because he knew, in a secret, shameful corner of his scientific mind, that the monster was right. He was horrified, yes, but he was also captivated. He was in the presence of something new and terrible in the world, and his clinical, curious mind was desperate, in spite of itself, to understand it. Forced into a terrifying new dynamic, Dr. Harding made a split-second decision. If the boy saw him as a fellow academic, he would play the part. He swallowed his revulsion and adopted a tone of clinical curiosity himself. "How long have you been conducting this research?" he asked, the words feeling like poison in his mouth. Timothy considered the question seriously. "Since I was 5, he replied matter-of-factly. "Maybe earlier. I started with insects first, then progressed to mice, then to bigger things. It's interesting to see how different biological systems react to the same stimuli. And the people who died," Harding pressed, his voice tight. Timothy shrugged, a small, casual gesture that was breathtaking in its monstrosity. "They were experiments, too. I wanted to see if people would react the same way as the animals. They do, for the most part, but they're better at understanding what's happening to them. Their fear is more complex. That makes the data more interesting." Dr. Harding felt a wave of nausea, but he forced himself to ask the final, most important question. "What are you planning to do next, Timothy? What is the next stage of your research?" The boy stopped walking and turned to look back toward the distant farmhouse, a thoughtful, calculating expression on his face, like a scholar contemplating a complex problem. "I have a new hypothesis I need to test," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, intellectual excitement. "All my previous human subjects were strangers or near strangers. The data is incomplete. I need to find out what happens when you introduce the variable of trust." He turned his gaze back to Harding, his pale eyes gleaming with a terrifying lucidity. "I need to observe the reaction when you hurt someone who trusts you completely. Someone who wouldn't suspect a thing until it was far, far too late. The implication was as clear as it was horrifying. He was going to murder his aunt and uncle. They were to be the subjects of his next, most intimate experiment. Dr. Harding looked at the boy's calm, expectant face and realized that this was not a distant plan. The intellectual passion in Timothy's eyes told him that the experiment had already been designed, and its execution was imminent. He knew he had, at most, days, but more likely, only hours before Timothy acted. The boy had revealed his intentions with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself utterly untouchable, and every tragedy in Sedalia County had proven that Timothy Caldwell did not delay once he had decided on a course of action. The quiet, grim walk back to the farmhouse was, for Drive Harding, a race against a clock that only he could hear ticking. That evening, Dr. Harding did not go home. He rode his horse hard through the gathering darkness, the horrific drawings wrapped securely in his medical bag, his mind ablaze with a single, urgent purpose. He went directly to the home of Sheriff William Crawford in Sedalia. Crawford was a practical, sober man who had served with distinction as a captain in the Union Army. The war had burned away any patience he had for wild theories or unsubstantiated speculation, but it had also taught him to trust the judgment of men he respected, and Dr. Harding was one of those men. In the dim, lamplit confines of the sheriff's office, with the rest of the town asleep, Harding laid out his case. He knew he was risking his career and his reputation, so he presented his findings carefully, focusing on verifiable facts, not his own psychological conclusions. He started with the impossible pattern of deaths and accidents, each one orbiting Timothy Caldwell. He recounted Eleanor Patterson's story of the terrified chickens and his own examination of their surgically broken necks. He documented the boy's unnerving, clinical knowledge of anatomy and violence. Then, with a heavy heart, he unrolled the drawings from the cave and laid them on the sheriff's desk. Crawford, who had been listening with a deep, professional skepticism, fell silent. He picked up the sketch of Mary Fletcher, his face hardening. As a veteran of Shiloh and Vicksburg, he had seen death in all its forms. He did not see a child's morbid fantasy in the drawings. He saw the work of a cold, calculating mind, noting the anatomical precision with growing alarm. The final, irrefutable piece of evidence was Harding's account of his conversation with the boy that very afternoon. He told me he intends to kill his aunt and uncle, Harding said, his voice low. He considers it his next experiment. That was the line that could not be ignored. Even if half of what you're telling me is true, Sheriff Crawford said, his voice a low growl, his eyes still fixed on the horrific drawings. We can't arrest a child for suspicions and a portfolio of nightmares. But he looked up, his gaze meeting Harding's. We can watch him, and we can be ready to act if he tries anything. The two men, a doctor and a lawman, both haunted by the ghosts of war, spent the next hour developing their strategy. Crawford brought in his most trusted deputies, men who had served under him during the war and could be counted on to remain steady under unimaginable pressure. They devised a comprehensive plan. Dr. Harding would make his scheduled visit to the farm the next morning as planned. Sheriff Crawford and his deputies would position themselves strategically around the property, concealed, silent, and ready. They would turn the Caldwell farm into a trap, hoping to catch a monster that wore the face of a child. The plan was put into effect the following morning under a sky the color of old iron. As Dr. Harding approached the Caldwell farmhouse in his buggy, a profound and unsettling quiet settled over him. The usual morning sounds of a working farm, the crowing of the rooster, the pecking of chickens in the yard, the grunting of pigs in their pen were completely absent. The property was held in a dead, unnatural silence that made the skin on his arms crawl. Before Harding had even climbed down from his buggy, the farmhouse door creaked open and Timothy appeared in the doorway. He stood perfectly still, his small frame silhouetted against the dark interior, his pale blue eyes tracking the doctor's every movement with a chilling, predatory focus. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, But Harding noticed with a jolt of alarm that the boy's sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and his hands and forearms looked as if they had been recently and meticulously scrubbed, the way a surgeon prepares for an operation. "Good morning, Doctor Harding," Timothy said, his voice carrying across the silent yard with its characteristic, eerie politeness. But underneath it, something had changed. There was a new current of anticipation, a hunting excitement that the boy was struggling to contain. "I've been waiting for you." The words, so simple and yet so loaded with terrifying implication, sent a fresh wave of cold dread through the doctor. The boy's use of waiting suggested he knew this was no ordinary visit, that he had perhaps even been counting on it as part of whatever monstrous plan he had already set in motion. Steeling himself, Harding entered the house. Inside, he found Thomas and Sarah Caldwell in their bedroom, both lying in bed, apparently sleeping peacefully. But as he approached Thomas's side to check his condition, he saw at once that this was no natural sleep. The man's breathing was far too shallow, and his skin had taken on a grayish, waxy pallor. "What did you give them, Doctor?" Harding asked, his voice a low whisper, not turning to look at Timothy, but feeling the boy's watchful presence right behind him. "Just some herbs I found in the woods," Timothy replied, his tone light and conversational, as if discussing a recipe. "There is so many interesting plants growing wild around here. Some of them have very useful properties, if you know how to prepare them." Harding checked Thomas's pulse and found it dangerously weak but steady. Sarah showed the same symptoms. They were both deeply unconscious, but, for now, they were still alive. Whatever poison or sedative Timothy had used, he had administered it with his usual terrifying precision. He wanted his victims helpless, but not dead. Not yet. Timothy seemed to read his thoughts. "They're not going to wake up for several hours," the boy continued, his voice full of a proprietary pride. "That should give us plenty of time to talk, without any interruptions." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Dr. Harding had ever experienced. Timothy spoke about his crimes with the cool detachment of a professor delivering a lecture. But it soon became clear that his past work was merely a prelude to the true purpose of this meeting. "All of my previous experiments have been with subjects who didn't know what was happening to them until it was too late," Timothy said, his eyes gleaming. "But you're different, Doctor. You understand exactly what I am and what I'm capable of. That makes you the perfect subject for a completely new type of study." He began to move around the room, gathering his tools with methodical precision: a heavy candlestick, a length of rope from the barn, several sharp kitchen knives he had positioned earlier. "I want to find out what happens when a person who knows he is going to die is presented with a choice," Timothy continued, his excitement growing. "Will you sacrifice yourself to try and save them?" He gestured to the bed. "Will you try to fight me, even though you know I have planned for that? Or will you try to run, to save yourself and abandon them to their fate? Your reaction, Doctor, will be the most fascinating data I have ever collected." The time for conversation was over. Doctor Harding knew he was in mortal danger. He drew the heavy Navy Colt pistol from his medical bag, his hand steady. "Step away from them, Timothy," he ordered. The boy looked at the pistol not with fear, but with academic interest. "A Navy Colt," he observed. "It holds 6 bullets, doesn't it? And how many people are in play?" "Uncle Thomas, Aunt Sarah, you, and me, and the 3 officers I saw taking positions in the woods this morning. That's 7 people. You're already 1 bullet short, Doctor." Ignoring the gun entirely, Timothy turned toward his sleeping uncle with the rope in his hands. That single, defiant act broke the standoff. Harding lunged forward, and Timothy moved with the speed of a quartered snake, producing a knife from his clothing and slashing at the doctor's arm. The struggle was brief but shockingly violent. Timothy fought with the desperate, feral ferocity of an animal, using the knife with a surgeon's knowledge of where to cut. He was smaller and weaker than the doctor, but he was also impossibly fast and fought with a cold, calculated rage. Harding managed to grab the boy's wrist and twist until the knife clattered to the floor. But Timothy immediately produced another blade he had hidden in his boot. Just as the boy lunged again, the farmhouse door crashed open. Sheriff Crawford and his deputies burst into the room, their guns drawn, taking in the horrific scene. The doctor struggling with the knife-wielding child, and the two still figures lying unconscious on the bed. A deputy quickly subdued Timothy, pinning him to the floor. When the chaos settled, Timothy Caldwell sat calmly in the corner of the room, his clothes torn and his face bloodied, but his pale blue eyes held the same cold, triumphant intelligence. "You can't prove anything," he said quietly to Harding. "No one will believe you." The sheriff loomed over him. "Attempting to murder your family is enough to see you locked away, boy." At this, the genuine smile returned to Timothy's face. "You won't hang me," he said with absolute confidence. "I'm young and far too interesting. Someone will want to study me instead." In the end, Timothy Caldwell was both wrong and devastatingly right. He was wrong about his immediate fate, but he was right about the fundamental impossibility of proving the full scope of his crimes. As Dr. Harding had predicted, when Sheriff Crawford attempted to present the portfolio of drawings to the county prosecutors, he was met with condescending disbelief. The meticulously documented murders were dismissed as the grotesque, but harmless fantasies of a deeply disturbed child, a product of the trauma he had endured. The pattern of deaths and accidents was attributed to a string of tragic coincidences. However, the attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell could not be so easily explained away. 3 sworn law enforcement officers had witnessed the boy, knife in hand, attacking his helpless relatives with clear and undeniable intent. The legal system of 1867, however, had no framework for such a criminal. Timothy was too young for an adult trial and the gallows, but he was far too dangerous for any orphanage or reformatory. He was an unprecedented problem. After weeks of legal debate that attracted attention from scholars and physicians across the region, a compromise was reached. Timothy would be remanded to the custody of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, where he would be studied and, it was hoped, treated by the most advanced medical minds of the era. Dr. Harding, feeling a grim sense of duty, volunteered to accompany the boy and remained at the hospital for 3 months, documenting Timothy's transition into his new environment. It was a transition that Timothy made with terrifying ease. He immediately recognized the hospital not as a prison, but as a new, more target-rich laboratory. He quickly learned to mimic the emotions the doctors wished to see, becoming their star patient. He could produce convincing tears when discussing his past, express a remorse so seemingly genuine it moved nurses to pity, and display a profound gratitude for the care he was receiving. Several of the hospital staff began to speak of a remarkable breakthrough, believing the boy was finally overcoming his trauma. But Dr. Harding, watching from the margins, saw the truth. Timothy was merely studying a new set of subjects, learning to manipulate them with even greater sophistication. He was building a comprehensive catalog of human emotional responses, not to understand them, but to weaponize them. In his journal, Harding wrote, "The subject displays remarkable cognitive abilities, coupled with a complete absence of genuine emotional response. He has learned to simulate normal human reactions, with sufficient skill to deceive most casual observers. But extended observation reveals the performance to be entirely artificial." Harding went on to describe his chilling realization. Timothy understands sadness as the face a person makes to elicit sympathy and aid. He understands happiness as the expression one uses to signal that a pleasant situation should continue. He comprehends the mechanics of emotion perfectly, but has never once, I believe, actually experienced the feeling itself. He is a flawless actor, playing a part in a language his soul will never speak. As Timothy's performance of sanity grew more convincing, a quiet, inexplicable darkness began to fall over the hospital itself. Other patients, particularly those who had interactions with Timothy, started to die. An elderly patient who had argued with a boy over a checkerboard suffered a fatal accidental fall down a short flight of stairs. Two others, who had been in relatively good health, died of apparent heart failure in their sleep, both having spent the previous afternoon in the garden speaking with a charming, sympathetic Caldwell boy. The incidents were subtle enough to be dismissed, but they bore the chilling hallmarks of Timothy's methods. It was Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, a visiting alienist from Boston with an expertise in European psychiatric techniques, who uncovered the truth. Intrigued by the case, she reviewed Timothy's therapeutic journal, which the staff saw as proof of his rehabilitation. But Dr. Fitzgerald, trained to look for hidden patterns, subjected the innocent-seeming entries to a series of analytical tests and discovered a sophisticated cipher hidden within the text. The decoded messages were a direct window into Timothy's cold, unrepentant mind. Far from feeling remorse, he was conducting a systematic study of the hospital, its routines, and its staff, analyzing their weaknesses for his ultimate goal, escape. One decoded entry was particularly chilling. Day 47. Dr. Fitzgerald believes my tears during today's session were authentic. Her response pattern indicates increased sympathy and reduced suspicion. Estimate 3 more weeks of consistent performance will be required to establish sufficient trust for physical contact. During sessions, the discovery led to an immediate lockdown, but it was too late. In the summer of 1868, during a transfer between buildings on a stormy night, Timothy Caldwell vanished. The official report cited a momentarily unlocked door and a distracted guard. But Dr. Harding knew better. It was the flawless culmination of a patient 18-month study. Timothy hadn't broken out of prison. He had simply graduated from his university in the years that followed. Dr. Harding began a lonely, obsessive quest, collecting newspaper clippings and reports of suspicious deaths and accidents throughout the Midwest. Many bore the signature of his former subject, carefully staged accidents, evidence of methodical cruelty, and often the lingering presence of a helpful, preternaturally intelligent young man who would appear in a town and then vanish just as mysteriously. Harding spent the rest of his life hunting this phantom, a ghost no one else believed in. The Caldwell farm was abandoned, and Thomas and Sarah lived out their days under assumed names, forever looking over their shoulders. Finally, in his last journal entry, written just days before his death in 1891, an elderly doctor, Harding reflected on the case that had defined and haunted his life. I have spent 24 years trying to understand what Timothy Caldwell represented, he wrote, his handwriting shaky, and I fear I have reached a disturbing conclusion. Timothy was not an aberration. He was a glimpse into what a human being might become when stripped of the moral and emotional constraints we consider fundamental to our nature. If he survived to adulthood, then somewhere in America, there walks a man who understands human psychology better than any trained professional, who can manipulate people with near supernatural skill, and who views the rest of humanity as nothing more than subjects for his unending experimentation. This chilling account reminds us that the greatest monsters are often the ones we refuse to see, hidden behind a mask of innocence. The case of Timothy Caldwell forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Is evil born or made? And what happens when it is not only brilliant, but also patient? Let us know your thoughts on this disturbing chapter of American history in the comments below. If this story captivated you, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who appreciates that the darkest mysteries are often the truest ones. Because the truth is often more terrifying than fiction, and history holds secrets that continue to challenge our very understanding of what it means to be human.